Now we're going to begin looking at the emerging popular culture of the 1920s. One major key to this was the development of the radio. So in the late 1800s, Guglielmo Marconi developed the radio, and so by the early 1900s, ships at sea had them, the military had them, but not many people in the general public had radios. Particularly by 1920, you still had most Americans not owning radios. And there wasn't any programming at this point in time. However, in 1920, a radio hobbyist near Pittsburgh began playing records over his radio. And so, people began to tune in. Well, this caught the attention of Westinghouse, which was a radio manufacturer. And they began to see that this could help expand their market for their product if there was more programming. And so they went on in October of 1920 to found the first radio station, KDKA. And then by 1922, the United States had 570 stations. Technical improvements in sound and size helped its popularity, and Americans now had a shared experience. And so, it became common for many American families to sit around the radio and listen to radio programs. And advertisers paid for the programming. And early on, you oftentimes might have one advertiser pay for an entire radio program. Now, of course, eventually, a lot of these major programmers, particularly ABC, CBS, and NBC, moved into television, and we began to initially see with television where one sponsor would bring you an entire television show. And then, of course, they moved into spot advertising, which is now more common in radio as well. But still, this idea of a shared experience developed out of it. And I think for a lot of today's teenagers, it may be somewhat hard to relate. I know when I was growing up in the 1970s, most Americans seemed to watch the same television programming. I mean, when you went to school, most kids were watching the same shows on the weeknights because, for the most part, most of us were pulling in television over our antennas, which only brought in a very small number of channels. You had your major networks and, the big three, and then you had just a few other channels that you could pull in. So most everybody watched the same shows or the same programming, giving everybody a shared cultural experience. Of course, technology has developed to the point now where many Americans have either satellite or cable television and have hundreds of channels to choose from. And plus, people have many other entertainment options. People have technology. They've got the internet. They've got social media. And those do help to spread a popular culture as well. But it also gives people the opportunity to really have an individualized experience, much different than having a collective experience. And that's where there's a big change. And so radio was the first time that people really had that opportunity for everybody kind of across the nation to have that kind of one, shared experience. And that began to help create a popular culture where around the nation, everybody kind of, tended to embrace the same types of things or find that common interest because of the way in which it was spread. Movies also played a major role. In the early years, movies were short, simple pieces. But during World War I, filmmaker D.W. Griffith produced The Birth of a Nation. And while this movie is widely recognized as being racist, it really portrays the Ku Klux Klan as being heroes and portrays African Americans as savages. But apart from the racial implications in terms of filmmaking, it was groundbreaking at its time. It introduced many new filmmaking techniques, and it helped to play a role in making film really a new viable form of entertainment. And it kind of advanced, I guess you'd say, the movie industry. Woodrow Wilson even screened the movie in the White House, and he said it is like writing history with lightning. So he was quite impressed with the technology of the movie. And of course, the movie, like I said, was controversial then and remains very controversial to this day. But in terms of just looking at it from a filmmaking perspective, it did do a lot to help advance film as a new art form. Some other major movies included The Jazz Singer, and many of you have probably seen some of the old films that were silent films, and that's what was normal. But it was in the 1920s that we first saw movies with sound, which is something, of course, that's now just what we consider normal. But in the old silent films, you'd see kind of a scene play out, and then they would cut away to just showing like a black screen with the dialogue on the screen, usually short, simple dialogue, and then kind of cut back into the scene, and you would have to read all the dialogue. But the idea of having talkies, or as they were referred to, movies with sound, was kind of groundbreaking. And so The Jazz Singer came out in 1927, and it amazed audiences. It was a hugely successful movie that incorporated just a few lines of dialogue, but it really helped to change the movie industry forever. And then also, just a year later, in 1928, the animated film Steamboat Willie introduced the United States to Mickey Mouse and cartoons. And of course, Walt Disney would go on to make many other cartoons and become very successful and expand, of course, from that to the theme parks that we now associate with Disney today. By the end of the 1920s, Americans bought 100 million movie tickets a week, even though the entire population of the United States was only 123 million. So, granted, you had some people that probably never went to the movies, but most Americans were probably going at least once a week, some 2-3 times a week. But of course, you also have to keep in mind that people didn't have television as an entertainment option, or computers, or any of the really electronic devices that we take for granted today. So going to the movies was really a neat treat. And the great popularity of movies in the 1920s also brought us a new kind of celebrity, the movie star. And one of the brightest stars of the period was Charlie Chaplin, who was a comedian whose signature character was a tramp in a derby hat and ragged clothes. And of course, Chaplin was very popular, did a lot of his work in the area around Niles Canyon. Niles was at one point in time believed that it was going to become the home of the motion picture industry, but then Hollywood came along and that kind of put an end to that. Rudolph Valentino was a dashing leading man of romantic films and was such a big star that his unexpected death in 1926 drew tens of thousands of women to the funeral home where his body lay. And Clara Bow was a movie star, nicknamed the It Girl. Mary Pickford was considered America's sweetheart and was married to Douglas Fairbanks Jr., a major star of action films. Their home, called Pickfair, was in Hollywoodland, later shortened to Hollywood, the center of the motion picture industry. Charles Lindbergh was a daredevil pilot who practiced his skills as an airline pilot, a dangerous, life-threatening job at the time. Lindbergh heard about a contest for $25,000 prize for the first aviator to fly a non-stop transatlantic flight, or a flight across the Atlantic Ocean. And he wanted to win. He rejected the idea that he needed a big plane with several engines, and instead developed a very light single-engine craft with room for only the pilot. And so on May 21st, 1927, Lindbergh succeeded by touching down in Paris, France after a 33-and-a-half-hour flight from New York. And of course, he went on to become a national hero. and earned the nickname Lucky Lindy. Amelia Earhart, a little over a year after Lindbergh's flight, became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, returning to the United States as a hero. And she went on to set numerous speed and distance records as a pilot. In 1937, she was most of the way around a record-breaking flight around the world when she disappeared somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. They've never confirmed conclusively what happened to her, although it's widely believed that her plane most likely went down over the ocean. As far as sports, radio helped to inflame the public passion for sports, and millions of Americans tuned in to broadcast of ball games and prize fights during featuring their favorite athletes. Helen Wills, for example, played powerful tennis, winning 31 major tournaments and 2 Olympic gold medals. Her nerves of steel earned her the nickname Little Miss Poker Face. Red Grange was a college football player who earned the nickname the Galloping Ghost for his speed, and he turned professional after college, which was shocking at the time. Babe Ruth was known as the Sultan of SWAT and was legendary on the baseball field for his home runs. His legend lives on today in baseball circles and in popular culture. Bobby Jones won golf's first Grand Slam, meaning that he won the game's 4 major tournaments and remains the only golfer to get a Grand Slam for matches in 1 calendar year. The great economic and social changes of the 1920s offered novelists a rich source of materials. F. Scott Fitzgerald helped to create the flapper image and coined the term the Jazz Age, and explored the lives of the wealthy in The Great Gatsby and other novels and stories. Sinclair Lewis wrote about the emptiness of middle-class life. Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote poems on topics ranging from celebrations of youth to leading social causes of the day. Willa Cather and Edith Wharton produced notable works of literature. Ernest Hemingway and John Dos Passos were war veterans, and as a part of the so-called Lost Generation, wrote about war experiences. Gertrude Stein invented the term Lost Generation, referring to a group of writers who chose to live in Europe after World War I. Bruce Barton's novel compared Jesus to a modern business executive. George Gershwin was a composer best known for Rhapsody in Blue, which showed the impact of jazz, as well as popular songs written with his brother Ira.